As a trucker, there are pretty much only a few options for where you can sleep at night while on the road. If you're really tired or nowadays over your daily driving limit, you can just pull over on the side of the road if there's room. If you're lucky, you'll find a truck stop with enough open spaces for you to park and catch a few hours of sleep. Then there's my least favorite, parking in the back of a public lot and sleeping. The most common places you'll find truckers doing this are at big stores like Walmart, but just because it's common doesn't always mean it's safe. That being said, one of my worst nights on the road was when I happened to be picking up a large shipment from a department store in the same plaza as a Walmart. It was an out-of-state delivery that brought me near Eagle Pass, Texas, right on the border between Texas and Mexico. And because the pickup was so early in the morning, I decided to sleep in the back of the parking lot. The only upside to this was that I got to go inside and grab some food to eat. That being said, as soon as I walked out of the store, I started to regret my decision. I was walking toward my truck, and to my surprise, I noticed two guys walking out from behind the passenger side as if they were trying to do something to my truck. I asked them if I could help them with anything and why they were standing so close to the truck when they have a whole parking lot to be in. They didn't give me a straight answer. They basically just snickered and walked past me as if I wasn't even there. I decided to just brush it off and not get into any sort of conflict, so I just got back in my truck and began eating my food as I watched a show on my phone. About an hour passed, and by that point, the sun had finally set, and I was getting pretty tired from being on the road all day, so I got ready to lay down. I made sure both the doors were locked, and then I pulled the curtain sealing off the cab and the driving compartment before laying down and going to sleep. After sleeping for a few hours, I woke up to a loud noise that sounded like it was coming from the back of my truck. I sat up and got ready to check it out when, out of nowhere, I heard the sound of glass shattering. I leapt up to my feet as the passenger side door of the truck unlocked, and one of the guys I saw earlier that night rushed into the truck. I put my hands up to cover my face as I saw something swinging toward me. The impact of what I noticed later was a metal bar, most likely the crowbar from the back of my truck, sent a shock through my entire upper body as it cracked into my arms. I fell backward, but was quickly grabbed and pulled out of the truck before being thrown onto the cold parking lot. I looked up, but my eyes took a second to adjust to the street lights, and by the time I was able to see the two people standing over top me, I felt the metal bar slam down on me. I keeled over and began laying in the fetal position as the two guys continued to hit me, and when they were finally finished, I could feel them rummaging through my pocket. I rolled to my side to try to keep them from getting my keys, but as soon as they saw I was conscious, they began striking me again, this time until I blacked out. I don't know how long I was unconscious, but when I finally woke up, I could tell that I wasn't on the gravel anymore. I couldn't see anything around me, but as I felt around with my hands, I realized that I was in the back of my truck with the shipment. I took a second to take everything in, and I realized how hard it was for me to breathe. With each breath I took, it felt like I was being stabbed in the lungs. Before I could bring myself to sit all the way up, I felt a bit of shaking, which told me that the two guys had stolen my truck with me in the back of it. I tried my best not to move at first because of the pain that I was feeling from almost every side of my body. But as I felt the truck slowly come to a stop, I knew that I needed to get ready for anything. I didn't know where we were or what these guys wanted. I slowly sat myself up and then managed to bring myself onto my knees. I slowly crawled toward the back of the truck toward the door. I didn't really have a plan. I just knew that once they opened the door, I needed to get as far away from them as possible by any means necessary. The moments passed and there was no movement from the front of the truck or the truck itself since we stayed parked. But after what felt like an hour, I finally heard the sound of both the driver and the passenger side door opening and closing. I prepared myself as I heard the latch at the bottom of the door unlocking. As it slid open though, I was unable to move as I was blinded by two flashlights pointed right at me. That was when I heard something I didn't expect. It turned out the two guys who mugged me and stole my truck were driving so poorly that they got themselves pulled over. I was now staring at two uniformed officers who promised me that an ambulance was on the way and that I was going to be just fine. When all was said and done, I was told that the two men had connections to a group in Mexico, and they believed that the men were attempting to cross the border with the shipment to sell the truck and the products we were shipping. There's no telling what would have happened to me if the truck had successfully made it across the border, but something tells me that I wouldn't be alive right now. I used to think that driving a truck in New York City was the toughest job that I ever had. But the second I started driving for a distribution center further upstate, I realized that those dense city streets were nothing compared to the winding mountain roads, especially when it rains. Now, my biggest mistake came when I was dragging old habits from driving in the city to the new area that I was working in. It was my third week on the job, and I was heading from the warehouse in Wurtsboro, New York, with a shipment that was going up toward Albany. It was about 1:30 in the morning when I noticed that the rain was starting to come down, and I turned my wipers on. I let out a groan because I knew that this meant I would have to slow down whenever the GPS took me off the highway, which happened pretty frequently, especially toward the end of the drive as I was passing over the mountain. As soon as I got onto the off-ramp, I began slowing the truck down and continued to take it as slow as I could as I began winding my way down the mountainside. My speed started to pick up a bit, but I didn't want to lock the brakes unnecessarily, so I only slightly pressed on the brakes, which probably wasn't the smartest decision I've made. The speed continued to pick up, and finally, I decided that I needed to press the brakes a bit harder. But as soon as I did, I felt the truck starting to slip out as if I had just begun to hydroplane. I finally felt my tires gain traction again and I slammed down on the brakes, but it was too late. A turn was coming up and I tried my best to make it, but as the truck was coming to a stop, the front end of the cab tore right through the guardrail. I closed my eyes as I expected the truck to go flying off the side of the mountain, but somehow it managed to come to a stop before the entire thing went over. I opened my eyes as the truck came to a complete stop, and I looked in the side mirrors and saw that the rear section of the truck was caught on the guardrail. That was the only reason why I wasn't sent plummeting downward, likely to my death. I slowly moved to lean out of the window to see if there was anything underneath me, and as I leaned my head out, I could see that there was about 20 feet of nothing between me and the ground below. I slowly sat back down in my seat as I tried to figure out my best course of action. I reached for my phone, and as I moved a bit, I could hear the sound of creaking in the metal behind me. I moved even slower as I grabbed my phone and called emergency services for help. I told them my location and the situation I was in, and they assured me that help was on the way and not to move. I have to admit, I contemplated trying to climb out of the door and over to the road, but as I said, every move I made seemed to disturb the position of the truck, so I didn't want to risk causing it to fall further. I sat there for 3 hours as I waited for the fire department to reach me. With each gust of wind that blew by, I prayed that the truck would hold me up. Finally, the fire department figured that their best course of action would be to lean a ladder out toward my truck with a harnessed up fireman on it. Once he got to my door, he asked me to slowly open it, but to not let it swing open. I moved as cautiously as possible as I reached for the handle and opened the door. I tried to open it slowly like he said, but as soon as it was cracked, the wind whipped up and tossed it open. The truck shook a bit and all of us held our breath wondering what was going to happen. Thankfully, it didn't budge as much as I feared, and once the door was open, the firemen helped me into a harness and then out onto the ladder that they extended over toward me. I crawled back to the safety of the road and looked back to my truck as I wondered what was going to happen. The emergency services informed me that a towing company would be called to move the truck and get it off the mountain, but in the meantime, I was given a ride to the nearest hospital to make sure that I didn't have any injuries. I was fine though. The truck was in far worse shape than I was, considering that it took them a whole day to pull it back onto the road. The frame was damaged beyond repair. The only bright side of the entire event was that I came out of it unscathed. Whenever I needed to pull a really early shipment from a warehouse, I prefer to just sleep in my truck in the parking lot rather than going home and driving to the warehouse to pick up the rig in the morning. The peace you find can often turn into something haunting. I learned that it was probably best for my own peace of mind to stop looking out the truck windows at night after what I saw underneath the streetlights. I still can't quite explain it, but I'm almost positive that it was another person, but their actions were so strange. You see, it was the middle of June on a night after it had just rained, so the air was filled with a thick fog that made it nearly impossible to see anything. Even the lights in the parking lot only seemed to be able to brighten up the spot directly underneath them. As I sat in my truck, getting settled in for the night, I pulled out my hot plate and got ready to make a small box of mac and cheese for myself. Normally, that was my favorite part of the night, but for some reason, I couldn't shake this feeling that there was someone watching me. I kept looking out the windows and around the truck, but from what I could tell at first, there was nothing or no one there. I decided to cook and then eat my food as the time continued to flow. And just as I was getting ready to step outside and rinse the pot that I cooked in out with a jug of water that I kept in the back, I saw it. Looking through the passenger side window, I could see what seemed to be a figure dressed all in white standing underneath the streetlight. It was hard to distinguish what it was that I was looking at from the fog that surrounded it, but as I continued to look, I could make out more and more details. After sitting in the passenger seat just watching them, it appeared as if they were staring directly back at me. Now, even though everything in my body was telling me to just stay in the truck, I also started to wonder if maybe it was just a warehouse worker who might need help with their car or something. Against my better judgment, I began rolling my window down a bit and called out from my truck, asking them if they needed any help, but there was no response. The figure just cocked its head to the side a bit and continued to stare in my direction. After a moment of silence passed, I was too uncomfortable to leave the window open anymore, so I closed it and then made sure that all the doors were locked and secured. I turned to look over to the driver's side to make sure that the door was locked all the way, and by the time I looked back to the streetlight, the figure was gone. For a second, I felt a bit of relief, but then that overwhelming feeling of something watching me was back. I frantically looked around the fog, hoping to catch a glimpse of where that person went. It took me a moment, but eventually, I found them. I practically jumped out of my seat and into the back of my cab out of fear as I noticed that they were now walking toward my truck with their heads still cocked to the side. Even though I was sure that I was looking at a person, I couldn't help but get the sense that there was something much darker involved here, even though I know that's ridiculous. I locked eyes with the figure as it got closer and closer to my door. To my surprise, it eventually passed right by me, but to my horror, I realized that it was only to circle around the truck. The figure disappeared behind the truck's blind spot, and that was when I heard a sound that made my skin crawl. As if they were dragging metal across metal, there was this intense screeching noise that came from the trailer that was hooked up to the back of the truck. I tried to find the source of the noise, but by the time it stopped, I couldn't see anything or anyone. I sat in my truck for another few minutes in fear, looking over my shoulder every other second, wondering where that person had gone to. Thankfully, they never came back. But when I woke up the next morning and stepped outside the cab to do my inspection, I realized that there was a massive scratch running along the back end of the trailer. I looked around for any sign of the person that I had seen the previous night, but I couldn't find anything. And when I spoke to the warehouse manager about the incident, she mentioned that a similar instance occurred to another driver about 2 years before me, but no one could ever find out who it was that was standing in the parking lot. All I know is that was the last time I decided to sleep in the cab instead of in my bed when I had the option, even if it means waking up and driving to the truck really early in the day.
Are you ready to dive into the darkest depths of fear and suspense? Don't miss out on our latest spine-chilling tales and terrifying encounters. Subscribe now to Dark Tales, horror stories, and join our community of brave souls who dare to explore the unknown. Hit the subscribe button below and prepare yourself for a journey into the shadows. Subscribe now and let the nightmares begin.